Good morning.
Morning.
Hope everyone is doing well. Feels like we'll get a real summer here in the next couple of days. So if you have some piled up wet chi, good time to burn it up. Be careful. I just returned this morning. Got up a little early and drove back from a cabin up on the Mackenzie River, where I spent a couple nights with my father and one of my brothers. We had a nice time, and so my father grew up in Ohio, where I was born. We moved here when I was 4 to Salem, and then I moved down to Eugene as an adult. But my father, growing up in a small town in Ohio, hadn't traveled very much, pretty poor, and he was the first in his family to go to university, and then he became an architect, and he started working in Ohio, and then he got a job offer out here in Oregon, and so he moved out from the cornfields of Western Ohio, very flat. Whenever we would visit, I didn't think a place could be so flat, and he moved to this wonderland that we all live in. And so being with him for a couple days up on the Mackenzie in that area was really special. But the reason I want to tell you about it is because I noticed a skill that my father has that is really a really good skill. I maybe even say a trick. I don't know if it's a trick. In English, that's such not a nice word because it also means like you're sort of cheating a little bit. In Japanese, there's a word kotsu. And kotsu means kind of like, what do you call it when you have the knack? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have the knack of doing something. So you say if you have the knack of doing it, it's the kotsu. So it's that kind of thing. It's not a sleight of hand. It's just he has this way. And it is that... So we traveled to many places. We went first to D. Wright Observatory, up the old Mackenzie Highway. We stopped by Scout Lake, and then we went into Sisters, and then we came around and went to the headwaters of the Metolius, and then down onto the Metolius a little bit, and over to Subtle Lake, and up to a Scout Lake that's behind that, and then down. We were thinking we might go by Clear Lake and the falls and things, but he was a bit worn out, so my brother and he are going to go to that today. And he's 85, and he spent so much time in these places. He loved Oregon, especially coming from that kind of a background. He backpacked a lot, and every place we went, he would say, "Oh, I remember when." Da 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 da. Which is, we all have that. We have memories, but this is the trick that he has. Every one of those places became meaningful to him. It wasn't just a memory, but it's significant. So we would visit someplace, we'd be there for 5 minutes or something, and say, "Hey, Dad, you want to go down to the water, do this, or do that, or do this, or do that," which is what people in their 50s or 30s or 20s say. And he's like, "No, it's good, let's go." It was enough to just touch it. Because for him, he's very aware that the doing is not so possible now and soon will come to an end. But when he would go to each of those places, I would see how something would just, like he knew something. Because these were the places of his being, kind of sacred places to him. And that they were related to memories, but he wasn't simply dwelling in the memory. He was... knowing the importance of these things, and that's what he had been doing all along. And so the reason I'm telling you is I also encourage you to think about that a little bit. When you're engaging in something that's meaningful to you, of course the experience of it is important, but there's another side which is more subtle. And that more subtle side where you know the worth, you know the value of life, and of being together with, and the meaningfulness of that is what really sustains us, and what helps us prepare for the next journey. I hope it's not a while for him, but it will come. And what is that What will he go with? Because you can't take most of it with you. Okay, so that's one thing. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about, go into some of the things I was presenting last week, because it was a lot. I didn't, sometimes I'm giving a Dharma talk and think, oh yeah, boo, 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 and then I get partway through and I'm like, oh wow, that's a lot. So I wanted to go back and visit a little bit of what I was saying last week and unfold it a bit. So I've been giving this series of talks. Many of you have been here for some of them or all of them on this teaching of the gate of not two. And that this was a very important teaching to me as a young monk when I was first studying with my teacher. And I've sort of lived with it for the past 30 some odd years. And that it's become increasingly meaningful to me over that time, and I reflect on it again and again. So I'm trying to present both this teaching of the gate of not two, but also to kind of model for you a little bit what it's like when you receive a teaching that is important to you for some reason, and how you take care of it by not just sort of knowing what it means, but by letting the teaching come back to you again and again in different circumstances and in different situations. So that's certainly been the case for me with this one. So I talked about how the gate of not two as like, look, you can't just do everything all the time. You actually have to pick something and do it. That was one of the first ways it was an important teaching to me. Also this kind of teaching of the gate of not two-ness, or a gate of non-duality, that there's this gateway that we can approach in which we really make an effort to release how it is that we're splitting everything all the time into opposites, based on our own kind of greed, hate, and delusion is what Buddhism would say. And then this third way, that gates are not two. That a gate is an expression of not two-ness. That's what a gate means. And that our consciousness itself, whether that's consciousness as expressed through eyes or ears or nose or tongue or body or mind or heart, any way that consciousness is expressed, in Buddhism we call that a gateway. And that those gateways themselves are not two. That those gateways are non-dual. That those gateways are the fountain of wisdom that allow us to live in a different way than when we're pulling everything apart into two constantly. And so last week I was picking out one of these gateways that we could pay attention to, and that was not a sensory gateway in particular, but the gateway of the inner and the outer. That it's very natural for us to have an experience of there being an outer world and an inner world. And that a lot of what we're doing in Buddhist practice, certainly in meditation, is that we're allowing, this is one reason that this type of meditation is different than many types of meditation. We don't shut off the gateways. We throw them open. So your eyes, we don't close them. Your ears are open. Fragrance, hopefully it's a fragrance, not a smell. Taste, everything is there. But we're not fiddling with them. We're letting that gateway be open so that the expanse of the external world is not cut off, but we're also not throwing ourselves out into the outer world and forgetting the inner world. That threshold of the outer and the inner is a sacred gateway, which we're caring for with this meditation. I mean, that's one of the meanings of this mudra. So this mudra is here like a gateway over your hara, or this is a very important kind of spiritual point in South Asian religious traditions. So it's a kind of an enshrining. There's a gateway here. Actually, there's gateways everywhere, but here we're showing the kind of centrality of the gateway with our hands, the outer and the inner, a gateway in which they are not two. Okay? And whatever is appearing outwardly is appearing inwardly. Whatever's inwardly appearing is appearing outwardly. And I was making this point. Both directions are completely immeasurable and ungraspable. And this creates a big problem for us in many situations. Because as our consciousness experiences things in what we think of as an outer way, we affix to them. The Prajnaparamita Sutras, which many of you study, would say that we abide in them. We take our home we take our place of being in the object of our consciousness. So, you know, we have this great experience, and then we live inside of that experience. We think that's what is true, the experience. And that's what we try to grab onto. And in grabbing onto it, it presents this problem for us because it is ungraspable. And that ungraspability, we could call, creates a kind of dissatisfaction or suffering, or dukkha in the Buddhist term. But what I was emphasizing last week is that is also a gateway. When you come across that ungraspability of the outward experience, it's an invitation to an inward life. And that usually what we're doing when we think we're losing it, the thing that we've grabbed onto, is we create a kind of rigid sense of self for the purposes of being to hold on. And it just gets more and more and more painful because the inner world shuts down. It just becomes affixed in a certain, like, obsession or demand. And when it does that, then we don't really know how to touch the outer world. We can't really even be with the thing that we want to grasp onto. So that we can use these situations, the places that are maybe easier to see are the places where it's most difficult. So I was talking a little bit about grief and the way that when we have loss, whether that's loss through someone's passing, or that's loss of certain situations or certain relationships or other things, but when that absence kind of rears its head, we have this opportunity to not just say, okay, I have to just live with it, right? Or to try to grab on harder, but to feel the grief and all of its shades as an invitation to an ungraspable inner world. Because the inner world is equally ungraspable to the outer world. Your emotional, psychological world goes on forever. There's no stopping point. Right? There's no guy, you know, in those old cartoons where there'd be the creature and they kind of open them up and there'd be the little guy in there with the levers. Which is hilarious, but we all kind of think that's there. There's like a real me, like this essential me-ness that's there, that's animating everything and doing everything. But Buddhist teachings tells us, no, that's not the case. It doesn't mean there's no you. It just means that the you is ungraspable. It's not something which you can find the edges of and just kind of pull together and say what it is, which is oftentimes what we do when we experience something like grief. So that is a beautiful opportunity within the difficulty of life. It's also an opportunity within the joys of life. I'm just picking out this kind of difficulty because oftentimes that's a place where there's an entry point that we're willing to take. In the joy, often we're not so willing to take it because it just keeps going until it doesn't, right? And then that's where we get kind of caught. So, but amongst the joy is also very good to open up that inner world, and you can do it there. So I don't mean to only sort of point you to the bummer gateways. There's also many positive gateways, but that's just a place where you can see the dynamic maybe more easily. So we have this teaching comes from the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is oftentimes translated as the Flower Garland Sutra. It's a very important sutra in Mahayana Buddhism and deeply affected particularly East Asian expressions of Buddhism. And in the Avatamsaka Sutra there is this image is presented of this net of Indra. So it's oftentimes called the jeweled net of Indra. And the teaching says that the cosmos, every dharma or every grain of sand, every thing of the cosmos is like a jewel. And that jewel is infinitely faceted, and it reflects every other jewel in all of the cosmos. So that throughout space and time, there is this vast net in which everything is reflecting everything else in a very particularity of that everythingness. It's a very beautiful image. I think when people, if you read about this or hear it, for me at least, it immediately gives me kind of relief and terror at the same time. I mean, not I don't know, terror is not the right word, but it's like, oh, okay, can't, like, don't go to sleep, right? Don't just sort of turn off. It's like there's something to pay attention to here. So kind of a call to attention. Maybe that's what I would say. Call to attention. But the reason I'm bringing that up is I think oftentimes when we take this image as a kind of a metaphor, we set ourselves outside of it. So here I am looking at the cosmos, which is this jeweled net of Indra, in which every particular thing reflects every other thing else in the cosmos. But of course we can't be separate. We are also one of those jewels. And so there's no way to grasp that. There's no way to say who I am apart from the entirety. And so when we're talking about this kind of gateway, that's a thing you can think about. If you're actually one of those jewels, you don't get the removed perspective of, oh yeah, isn't that nice? There's all these jewels which reflect each other and I'm gonna have a nap now. Actually, you are in the process, whether you're aware of it or not, want it or not, are in that reflective aliveness continuously. And so the gateway that we're talking about here, I'm sort of making up a story here about the inner and the outer. What we think about as the outer and what we think about the inner is really simply the reflective quality of this jewel. And that there's no way to separate everything out, but there's also no way to just smush it all together. That each and everything is, its ungraspability is that reflection of all things. So when we come to this practice of the gate of not to, through meditation, for example, it takes a really, it takes a lot of and a very particularly kind of effort. It's not the effort to try to achieve or to make things be a certain way, but it's the effort in which that luminosity becomes revealed. I can't force that because it's already there. It's already what's happening. And yet, I'm always making this struggle with what's happening. And in that making of the struggle, I can't find my pathway with that essential luminosity of the ungraspable. And the ungraspable becomes a problem. It becomes loss. It becomes, I can't figure it out. It becomes, I don't feel like I have any place to stand. The Prajnaparamita Sutras, which much of this teachings come from, over and over in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Buddha will say, a person who hears this teaching and is not afraid is a bodhisattva. And I oftentimes, when I read that, I think, ooh, yeah. Because it really does challenge our deepest ways of operating, where we think I'm going to get things done through this process of, this kind of process of grasping. So the effort within meditation, again, is not an effort in which we're going to grab onto particular kinds of experiences or try to make a certain thing happen in meditation, but we're working with the very way that we are, with the foundations of our being, the foundations of our consciousness, as opposed to trying to pick out this particular thing. So this can be very confusing because you might be having a lot of trouble in meditation, for example, and you go to a teacher and ask them, report and advice, and oftentimes you'll get back is great, and you think no, not great. Did you hear what I said? And then they'll say, yeah, it's great, because actually you have to feel that if you're going to know the gateway of the inner and the outer that I've been talking about. If you don't feel it, if you don't encounter it, then you won't be able to know the aperture. You won't be able to know the gateway. You won't be able to know the inseparability of that outer and inner. So this is giving you an opportunity to do that. Now, teachers can get sloppy and simply say whatever crappy things happen to you is good for you, right? That's not true. That's not the point of that teaching. or that you should put up with abuse, or you should put up with unkindness or any other things because it's good for you. That's really a wrong teaching. But what you should be able to do is feel why those things are both ungraspable and significant. The ungraspability doesn't mean that they're not significant. It means that there's a whole world that opens up there. The kind of non-technique of the appreciation of a sacred place, a sacred gateway. That's what at least this style of meditation is inviting us to. And that non-technique is actually really difficult in terms of the amount of effort that you have to bring to not just fall into, I'll do this and this is what will happen. I'll do this and this is what will happen. I wish I could do this and make that happen. Or I'll just clench down because I don't know what to do and hopefully the bell will ring pretty soon, right? Which all of those things will happen to you. If those things are not happening to you ever when you meditate, you're doing something weird. You're clamping down somewhere and you're not paying attention, okay? So all of those things should, it's natural and important that they're happening, but as opportunities to release something as opposed to trying to grab on to this thing that you're going to become. This is in Buddhism what we call prajna, or wisdom. The ungraspability of things being the gateway to living. And it's so simple that mostly we kind of evade it in some way. I would say the really good news in this is, as I spoke about a little bit last week, that the term in Buddhism for ignorance, which is the thing that animates all of the kind of grasping, the Chinese characters mean no illumination. It was kind of interesting that's where ignorance comes from. I don't know the etymology of the word ignorance, but in Buddhist lingo it means not luminous. And so there's this idea that if you take all of those jewels and you start making up this story about how they don't reflect each other, how they're all split apart and isolated in some way, the luminosity disappears. That's also what the Buddha called suffering. Because at any moment that we are engaged in that game, and that's most moments, where we're making the division, the luminosity disappears and the anxiousness appears. Because it's an unstable situation, and we know, not in a kind of grasp-knowing way, but our consciousness is it's on a balance beam. That kind of separation takes a sort of energy to keep us there, and it's unstable, and we know that it will come apart. Or our being has that capacity to feel the energy that it's taking to keep on that balance beam. So when we practice this way, we find that those very places where we're holding on and we're balancing, as we're able to just allow the invitation, then there's a luminosity that emerges. This is why it's so amazing that through tragedy there can be joy. Through real difficulty. And we have a lot of that all the time. And right now we have our own particular flavor of that, which has a lot of intensity, at least for me, and I think for many people. So what is our job is not to be mired in the ungraspability and difficulty of it, but we can't run from the ungraspability and difficulty of it. And that's where real strength and joy and possibility come from. So I'd just like to encourage you, as you continue in the practice, feel for that. Feel the place where that luminosity. If I go back to my dad, that's where he went to the woods. At first it was like, dang, these aren't cornfields, wow. And then he found that there's this pathway, there's this gateway. When you stand there at this, particularly the bodies of water, which are like, I've been reading this Swedish poet whose name I can't remember, and he has this one line where he says, and the water is like windows into the earth. And when I first heard that, I was, whoa. I mean, that's exactly how I experience it, windows into the earth. So you come across, Blue Pool. By the way, I hope they shut that down for a little while. I think they're going to. Like, people ever go to Blue Pool? Oh, this is amazing. But I think it should. I think that I was telling my dad yesterday. I was thinking that's a place that they should regulate. But anyway, when you look into Blue Pool, it's like you know something you couldn't know another way, and it's not just because Blue Pool is so spectacular, but it's because that kind of aesthetic moment is an expression of the ungraspability. And that goes that way and this way at the same time. And you know that you know something you couldn't know in any other way. And that's the trick, I think, that my dad stumbled on when he came out here with a load of stinky boys and hauled us around out in the woods. If there's any questions or comments?
I was thinking, as we were talking of the story about the father who goes away.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of like going down rabbit holes in YouTube, kind of got obsessed with the new musician. And I'm thinking about like Manjushri and like my avoidance of, I avoid what's happening in the world. I don't listen to news, whatever.
Yeah.
And when any family member tells me things, it affects me so much.
Yeah.
And so I'm like seeking, like praying for Manjushri to come, or something, like seeking that. And then I was just going down a rabbit hole and realized at some point, like that suffering, like I just kept kind of going from video to video and like just going down that rabbit hole. And I could feel that suffering grow, like that kind of sick feeling that's just like, this is not good, this is not good, just growing and growing in me, like I'm just kind of obsessing and avoiding. And for some reason, it makes me think of that story about the father going away, so that we have to turn to that ungraspability in ourselves. We can't put like, say, you will save me, or you will fix things outside ourselves. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah. So, she's referring to the story of it's the Buddha telling a story about his lifespan. And it's called the Verse of the Lifespan. It's from the Lotus Sutra. And at the end of that, he says, just to kind of paraphrase, he says, look, I have to go. If I don't go sometimes, if my eternal body was just here all the time for you to interact with in a conventional way, that you would grab on. You become lazy, and you wouldn't really be able to overcome suffering. And when people first hear that, they usually think it's a confusing teaching, because they're like, well, I think it would actually be great if the living Buddha was here for me to interact with. But early on in that sutra, the Buddha says that if you're upright, gentle, and sincere, that actually the Buddha will appear to you. You'll see that the Buddha is here. So this is kind of what the teaching is playing with. And that kind of importance, that if the Buddha is always something that we can grab onto, then we won't actually face the issues. That's a really, really important dynamic in Buddhism. It's kind of the opposite of many religious impulses or spiritual impulses, to both venerate and to know that I am completely reflecting the Buddha, and the Buddha is completely reflecting me, and at the same time to know that the significance of that is that I need to face what there is to face. But I need to face it as the Buddha. I need to face it as a reflection of the Buddha. And that's where the practice is coming in. When you're talking, one thing I was thinking about is one of the ways we harden the internal world is attachment to suffering. So that way in which we obsess over the experiential quality of difficulty and tightness, that itself can provide a grounding, which for some reason we will oftentimes prefer over the ungraspability of our being. right? And so that's a very natural. We all do that. And so then these kind of difficulties become a way to reinforce that kind of internal solidification. But the real bummer about that trade-off is there's no real resolution of those internal conflicts because they're bound in the grasping dynamic of those two sides. And so we have to find the ungraspable quality of that, and that's where the deeper healing comes, where the internal and the external release is possible. But you can't force a release.
It's like the sword in the mirror, the edgeless mirror, still like and teasing us out constantly through this work.
Yeah, right. So I would say on a practical level, if you find yourself kind of like either overly avoidant of the difficulties of the world, and then you find yourself in cycles of just like watching until you can feel that stronger. The way forward there is not to be like, bad Gary, stop that. A little bit of that's okay. but the deeper thing is to say, whoa, do I want to do that? Like, no. I mean, I know the difficulty. And so then in knowing that, you're not just pushing it away. You're saying, oh, while I start doing that, what am I feeling? And as you drop all of the schemes of isolation, the ways in which we're just sort of cutting off that, then it becomes less compelling. And there's this other thing which is more compelling. And you have plenty of that in your life. So you know how that turn can happen. You just have to make the space for it and not be too judgmental of whatever YouTube fixation might emerge.
Habits.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Would you say something feels like really important in this conversation is a kind of discernment between what is dukkha and anxiety, mm-hmm. and what is difficulty, mm-hmm. and that there's a proper stewardship mm-hmm. of those, and that's always in the ground of our being. And as we're walking the path, we're discerning what is that anxiety that's replicating something and what hurts, and that we have to imbibe both of them and then start making some really subtle decisions about stewardship of our sorrow. Love to hear your thoughts about that.
So I think one kind of, I'm just making this up on the spot, so you have to play it out a little bit more. But the anxiety and the dukkha of a situation and the difficulty of the situation, they're like completely pressed together. We don't want to try to rip them apart, but the anxiety comes as that kind of instability that we intuitively know from the way that we are with the difficulty. So when the difficulty becomes a kind of hardening, then we know the instability of that, and the instability then shows up as a kind of like rumination and kind of anxiousness, feelings, etc. But when the difficulty, so we usually just have to feel that to begin with, and then know that the difficulty can also be an invitation to actually feeling what the difficulty is. And as we start to feel those places where our tightness is and that kind of anxiousness, then every one of those is an opportunity to say, okay, wait a minute, let me soften this, let me steward what is true here, and as I do that, then I'll know some other layer, and that ungraspable internal life becomes flexible and free, and in its freedom, then sorrow is no longer a rigid problem. So we don't want to try to just like discern and split them apart. It's more like, well, of course, if we're having difficulty, there's going to be the dukkha, the suffering, the anxiety along with it. It's just, that's what the Buddha diagnosed. But then he also said there's something to do about that. And so the something to do about it is to allow that to be an invitation. And so that's why we come back. Sometimes it seems really brutal. You might be in a really difficult situation and you come and sit on the cushion and you think, no way. no way. And sometimes it really is no way. You need to do something else. That's also true. But we develop that capacity to be there with what is, the Bodhidharma says to face the cliff unwaveringly, and to see that the sage and the ordinary person are not two. So you're there right at the cliff of life, the unyielding quality of being. And you're not splitting that into the person who knows how to do it and the person who doesn't know how to do it. You simply continue to face it, and that's where the knowing comes from.
I'm getting an image there of, the constant discussion of the sage and the ordinary person not having a different point of origination, and that we need those places. We need to enter those places of suffering with skill to find the new body of our that ever refreshing life that we also are. And if we try and keep a little bit of difference from it, we won't be able to find that.
And the biggest skill is to be willing to be a dumbass. I mean, because we are. Right? So it's not, the skillfulness is not just like, I really know how to handle this. The skillfulness is knowing I don't know how to handle it. And then showing up as in Japanese, it's such a good word, bonpu. That's we say ordinary person, and it sounds so like, bonpu. It's like the shonin and bonpu. And so in the sound of it has a nice ring. And so like, how is our bonpu involved? That's also why the Buddha says in that sutra, he's like, look, there's no separation here, right? But the separation is that upright, gentle, and sincere intention going to be what we rely on? When we do that, we see that this is the pure method. And we never know that unless we're willing to suffer, unless we're willing to be inadequate in all of those things. So the Dharma can never then reveal itself.
See, I guess I'm wondering, I'm trying to think about the words, the ungraspability as a gateway.
Yeah.
And the first question that came to my mind for you was, I was going to ask you if you could give us another metaphor for ungraspability, but instead, I want to run one by you.
Sure.
Okay. And so in the metaphor is in every encounter, instead of thinking, we can think about it inner and outer, but in every encounter we can also think about every act of doing, everything we do is always inevitably and inseparably an act of undergoing that we take place. So there's this kind of constant dance that can't be separated between doing and undergoing.
Right.
And so life is all action, life is all doing, but consequently life is all undergoing as well. Right. And if we get in the way of the undergoing, then we freeze up, we break up the system, we're not there for the whole process. And so I'm just wondering what your take is about the idea of this doing, undergoing, and ungraspability of.
If we think about it in kind of processes of time, then I think that's perfect, and that's one side of the teaching talks about all the time, that it is that inseparability of the constant motion. The phrase word is usually impermanence, but impermanence oftentimes becomes like the harbinger of bad news, and people kind of latch on to impermanence in that way. But impermanence also is just what you're saying. That's the quality of the non-selfness of our being. That there's no little guy in there pulling the levers. That process is going on all the time. Buddhism also Buddhist teachings will also emphasize the immediacy. So the process is sometimes the way that we would talk about it, but then also the immediacy is like, kind of like, there's no time really. Like it's already happening, will happen. All of those things are kind of really indivisible in an essential way. And that those also, the loops of our way of trying to conceive of those come up through imaginations in time as opposed to imaginations in space, where the like you and me stuff is usually a spatial relationship. The now and the then is a temporal relationship. So sometimes that's emphasized, and that's pretty trippy, because then the process is not an idea of there's constant movement. The process is the grasping. I'm kind of playing here a little bit, but the grasping onto the total interpenetration appears to us as movement, because that's the only way we can conceive. That's the only way our consciousness can conceive of anything, is to try to hold it, and in that holding, it always has to move to something else, because you can't hold it. And that's what time or processes are, more than other ways. So sometimes it goes that direction a little bit. But the great thing in Buddhism, it doesn't say actually it's any way. It says that, you've got a complex mind, I have a complex mind, so we can make like massive stories forever about that, which is great. It's a celebration. But then Buddhism will say, well, actually it's all empty, which doesn't mean that there's nothing. It means that actually all of those permutations or ways of expressing it have their place because of its ungraspability. Actually, I've been using the term ungraspable a lot. The Chinese that I'm coming for more precisely would usually be translated immeasurable. And I kind of like that translation too, because as long as we understand that any moment of grasped experience is a measuring, that's the way we grasp it, is through a kind of measurement and defining the boundaries of it, etc. So that's another one we can play with, immeasurable. Yeah. But in the big thing, and what you're bringing up, another reason is so important is because immeasurable, ungraspable does not mean nothing. That's really important. People hear these kind of teachings and they kind of confuse it with a nihilistic idea about things, like there's nothingness. Actually nothingness is quite full of everythingness. That would be more of the kind of Buddhist teaching. Can I tell you guys my teacher's joke? He only told me one joke once. A lot of you heard it before, which will go against what I just said, but it was really funny. He said to me, Ejo, what's the difference between a Buddhist and a nihilist? And I said, oh, master, what? He said, we're happy about it. Which isn't quite true, because it's not important, but I thought it was really funny. He thought he was being very funny. So I dutifully laughed, as you have, so thank you. Probably have time for one more if anyone has this question.
So since you started this series on Not Two Gates, I feel like I'm seeing it in a lot of pop culture. Like David Brooks had an article about why people still believe in Donald Trump, and Terry Real talks about it in like marital relations going from us, from you versus me to us. And both of them trace back the reason why we have this tension to the Enlightenment and the rise of the individual. And for someone who's been steeped in like training that Enlightenment is like the Enlightenment. Right. I'm having a little bit of trouble thinking about like if myself pre any of that Enlightenment training would have had an easier time with this, how much good I feel like that has brought versus this really big challenge. And I just wondered your reflections on like you were teaching this before those ideas.
Yeah. So the how do I say this? There's always a kind of poison with the medicine, and so these kind of processes that we see in the evolution of teachings or consciousness or humanity, I mean, I'd like to think they're always going forward. I'm pretty sure they're not. Sometimes they're going back and down and up and all these different things. But my personal perspective is that Enlightenment type thinking and that kind of sacredness of the individual, etc., was very important. And one of the ways it's important is it's a corrective to a poison that comes along with the teaching of not two-ness or inseparability. Because not two-ness does not mean that you are not an individual. But it's really hard for us to not let that kind of sneak in. And the kind of part of us wants to be like, oh, well, this is all just about, everything together, and not to see that the everything together really means that every single particular thing is 100% important. That I feel like puts us in a really good place, having come through, a handful of centuries of thinking about things in a particular way in the particularly industrialized countries. But that teaching also has a poison. And the poison that we're finding is, if I had to kind of sum it up, I would say deep isolation, deep soul isolation. And that will kill us. It won't just cause problems. It will wipe us out. And so I think these kind of teachings coming back to those is important. But why we take these kind of teachings, we don't want to take the other poison. So that's what we need to be careful of. And that's why I'm always trying to remind people well, in this talk, for example, look, it doesn't mean the opening up that interior world or the possibility to that ungraspability doesn't mean you should just take whatever comes your way. Actually, as an individual, you have a right to being treated a certain way, etc., which could come out of this kind of Buddhist philosophical position, and in some places it did. But the way we're most familiar with it is like in the story of the individual being sacred and having individual inalienable rights that cling to the individual, etc. So that's what I'm advocating anyway, is that we bring some of this ancient wisdom back in, but we're very careful that we don't utilize the poisonous side of us, which of course we will. There'll be a new poison that emerges, and we'll need other things to keep going. Yeah. I think another, there's a writer, to bring up kind of modern writers, which I think work with this stuff in a way that's been helpful for me, is a very famous writer, Wendell Berry. And he has did I give you in Sokai a book that has poetry and marriage and poetry in it? Or did I point you at it?
Nightstand, but it hasn't made it time.
Okay. So there's an essay, and you only have to read the first 2 paragraphs of this essay on, I can't remember if it's poetry and marriage or marriage and poetry, but he has this line, which I'm not gonna be able to say it correctly right now, but when you go read it, maybe you could bring it back to us next week and report it. He says something like, we think that life is a whole bunch of choices of which we will choose among one and hope to make it the best. And he says that's a misunderstanding. He says, actually, life is one choice which we will make that opens up into a mystery that we can't grasp. And I love that chiropractic he does in our thinking, because he takes us from the removed perspective as if life was just full of all these different choices, and I would kind of I'm going into the candy shop and choose what I'm gonna do. To no, actually I will choose, but there's only one thing, and that one life which I will choose is not something that I could ever know when I choose it. I'm going to choose without knowing what it is. I don't know. I mean, it might be a little yellow hard thing, but I don't know if it's butterscotch or lemon or whatever. I don't know, right? So that's the place where individuality is so important to understand that. But it's not the rigid individuality. It is this individuality that invites us into the mystery. And so that's just a person that came to mind while you were talking. All right. Well, I hope everyone finds a way to stay cool the next couple days. I always am trying to encourage people to. A lot of people hate the heat, and I get it, but just let it kind of mess with you a little bit, and then this thing kind of happens if you let it, but not too much, especially if it's it will affect your health.